What would you do to protect your child from criticism? Harry Truman, father and sitting president of the United States, wrote a letter threatening assault on a music critic who insulted his daughter's singing performance. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. Harry and Bess Truman were the parents of one child, daughter Margaret. When Truman became president, Margaret was 21 years old. As a child, Margaret loved music, like her father, whose instrument of choice was the piano. Margaret took voice and piano lessons in Independence, Missouri, from a family friend. After graduating from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., with a degree in History and International Relations in 1946, Margaret moved to New York to work on her singing career with celebrated voice teacher Estelle Liebling, training as a coloratura soprano. Her singing career took off quickly. On March 16, 1947, Margaret's career began on the Ford Motor Company's Sunday evening hour radio program.
In her first nationwide concert broadcast, she is Miss Margaret Truman of Washington, D.C.
Accompanied by the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, the ABC broadcast was heard by a record 15 million listeners. Although she was not living at the White House at the time, the White House switchboard received so many calls of congratulations on Margaret's performance, they were forced to shut down. The radio broadcast was followed by her first professional concert, again accompanied by the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. While Margaret never performed in staged operas, she would perform opera arias. Her performances were mainly of both sacred and secular art songs and works from the concert soprano repertoire. In her first full-length concert, held at the Syria Mosque Auditorium in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Margaret had 9 curtain calls and sang 3 encores. The press, fascinated by her show business aspirations, noted her exemplary stage presence and rapport with the audience. At the beginning of her career, critical reviews of Margaret's singing were positive, polite, or diplomatic in tone, with some later reviewers speculating that negative opinions were withheld in deference to her father as the current president. The president and first lady, while supportive and encouraging of her career, also tried to protect their daughter from the stinging words of critics. One example, in 1947, Washington Post music critic Paul Hume suggested that Margaret should refrain from public appearances for at least 2 or 3 years, during which time she could learn to sing properly. This was not necessarily new feedback for Margaret or her father. Margaret was also coached by Wagnerian opera star Helen Traubel. Traubel advised Margaret not to rush her career. Traubel believed Margaret, whose voice was too small and inexperienced, needed 5 more years of study, if not more. Traubel mentioned this to the president, insisting that Margaret be able to stand on her own and not rely on his position. Truman banged his fist on his desk in agreement. That's exactly what I want. But it was Hume's critique 3 years later that provoked Truman's anger. On the evening of December 5, 1950, Margaret performed in front of a sold-out 3,500-person audience at Washington's Constitution Hall. She stepped onto the stage in a pink satin dress and sang selections from Schumann, Schubert, and a Mozart aria from The Marriage of Figaro. Margaret received waves of applause and was called back for 4 encores. Her father, who was in attendance, said he had never heard her sing better, and he was not the only one who liked the performance. A review in the Washington Times-Herald the next day declared she sang better than ever before in her brief career. The Mozart aria was fresh and unforced, her voice charming. So imagine Truman's surprise when at 5:30 the next morning, Truman opened the Washington Post to the second section, page 12, to read Paul Hume's scathing review of his daughter's performance the night before. Margaret Truman, soprano, sang in Constitution Hall last night. Miss Truman is a unique American phenomenon with a pleasant voice of little size and fair quality. She is extremely attractive on stage, yet Miss Truman cannot sing very well. She is flat a good deal of the time, more last night than at any time we have heard her in past years. There are few moments during her recital when one can relax and feel confident that she will make her goal, which is the end of the song. Miss Truman has not improved in the years we have heard her. She still cannot sing with anything approaching professional finish. She communicated almost nothing of the music she presents, and still the public goes and pays the same price it would for the world's finest singers. It is an extremely unpleasant duty to record such unhappy facts about so honestly appealing a person. But as long as Miss Truman sings as she has for 3 years and does today, we seem to have no recourse unless it is to omit comment on her programs altogether. Truman went to his study in Blair House, where the Trumans were staying while the White House was under renovation, pulled out his White House stationery, and immediately hand-wrote a response to Hume. Mr. Hume, I've just read your lousy review of Margaret's concert. I've come to the conclusion that you are an 8-ulcer man on 4-ulcer pay. This is a strange phrase, but it suggests an individual is putting in an excessive amount of effort, creativity, or harsh criticism, 8 ulcers, relative to their reward or influence, 4-ulcer pay. But why an ulcer? Perhaps that implies twice the bile or bitterness. The letter continued. It seems to me that you are a frustrated old man who wishes he could have been successful. When you write such poppycock as was in the back section of the paper you work for, it shows conclusively that you're off the beam and at least 4 of your ulcers are at work. Someday I hope to meet you. When that happens, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beefsteak for black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below. Pegler, a gutter snipe, is a gentleman alongside you. I hope you'll accept that statement as a worse insult than a reflection on your ancestry. Pegler, by the way, refers to Westbrook Pegler, who was a right-wing journalist who opposed Roosevelt's New Deal and Truman policies. The letter was signed with Truman's initials, HST. Truman then placed the 130-word letter into an envelope, addressed it, and affixed a 3-cent stamp. He then went out for a stroll where he found a mailbox and posted the letter. While Truman wrote the letter, his anger was also channeling something else, grief. On the day of the concert, Truman's childhood friend and White House press secretary, Charlie Ross, had just completed a press conference and was at his desk preparing to make comments to the television news when he suffered a coronary occlusion and died. On the president's orders, Margaret was not told of Ross's death before her concert, a decision Margaret would resent. She would have said something in tribute to Ross at the concert if she had known. Ross was more than Truman's press secretary. He was his friend and calming influence. If Ross had still been alive, he would have recognized the impact Hume's review would have had on Truman. He may have been able to stop the letter from being sent. But the letter was sent, and Hume was surprised to receive it. After verifying its authenticity, editors at the Washington Post planned to publish it in their paper. But publisher Philip Graham vetoed the idea. Graham told colleagues that he had received a number of angry letters from Truman and that he would not publish any of them. Hume did show the letter to colleagues, including Milton Berliner, a music critic of the rival Washington Times-Herald. Berliner ran with the story, which then forced the Washington Post to acknowledge the letter. The story became international news, becoming a minor scandal for the Truman administration. Margaret Truman was continuing her concert tour in Nashville when she first heard of the letter. Her first reaction, not surprisingly, was disbelief and denial. In the first place, he wouldn't write a letter to Mr. Hume. My father wouldn't have time to write a letter. Margaret continued, "It's very easy to get a hold of White House stationery." She also commented, "Mr. Hume is a very fine critic. He has a right to write what he pleases." She could not understand why anyone would write such a letter and sign her father's name. Hume, who greatly regretted that the letter had ever been made public, told reporters he was entirely sympathetic to the president. "I can only say that a man suffering the loss of a friend and carrying the burden of the present world crisis ought to be indulged in an occasional outburst of temper." Hume's words did nothing to quiet the controversy. 10,000 letters and telegrams were sent to the White House. 2/3 of which were against the president. One man wrote, "My sympathy is with you about Margaret. My 4 children cannot sing either." An editorial in the Chicago Tribune declared that Truman's mental competence and emotional stability were in question. Letters to the editor in newspapers across the country expressed their disappointment in Truman's self-control and uncouth behavior. This was especially worrying given that Truman, as one reader noted, has the sole power of unleashing the atom bomb. It also turned out that reviews of Margaret's performances became more mixed through the rest of her 10-year singing career. Margaret later wrote that her father did not regret sending the letter because he insisted he had the right to be 2 persons, the President of the United States, and Harry S. Truman, father of Margaret, husband of Bess Wallace. Truman wrote another letter to Hume in February 1953. Hume had written a story lauding Truman as the president who had done the most for music in Washington. Wrote the ex-president, "My interest in music has been the interest of an amateur who is really fond of good music. I hope I helped some music lovers to have a better appreciation of the great composers." 8 years later, when he was in St. Louis to cover a concert by soprano Maria Callas, Hume called on Truman, whom he had never met, in his office in Independence, Missouri. The president played both of the pianos he had in his office, and the 2 men became friends. They had seats across the aisle from each other for the concert that night, and Truman introduced Hume to his wife Bess. Since the letter itself was sent by Truman to Hume, the original letter was in Hume's possession. Consequently, the letter is not included with his papers at his presidential library. In 1951, Hume sold the letter for $3,500 to an unknown private individual. The letter remained in private hands until 1983, when the Malcolm Forbes estate purchased the letter for an unnamed but substantial amount. In 2002, the letter was purchased by the Harlan Crow Library, a private library in Highland Park, Texas, founded by billionaire real estate businessman Harlan Crow, where it still resides today. Thanks for watching.